Good evening, everybody. Welcome to What's Next Beyond Service. This is a special edition of What's Next because usually we're on at 11 Pacific, but our guest today is a very busy man, and it was hard to kind of time down to a Thursday schedule, which is fine. So we're gonna go ahead and have our interview this evening, Tuesday evening, 4 o'clock our time on the Pacific coast here. And today, the episode is entitled "Ask for Help." And our guest today is Michael SUGRUE. Michael, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me. It's my honor.
Awesome. And I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm sure sometimes folks, may or not get it right. I hope I did.
You did. You got it right. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Good. So for those of you that are on LinkedIn, you probably, and especially if you're in the veteran military, first responder community, you probably know who Michael is. Michael served in the Air Force, in the security forces. He did a number of different things while serving. He was in law enforcement, global force protection, anti-terrorism, nuclear security, foreign airfield assessments, and then also air base ground defense. So, it's kind of a lot stacked up into his time. And while I'm thinking about that, when you're doing those foreign airfield assessments, Michael, are you working at all with Red Horse? Is there a connection there with that?
No, what I did was it was very small teams with different people with different skill sets.
Right.
And we actually, in this case, went in plain clothes, worked closely with the embassy. And my specialty was security forces, so the protection of potential air bases. And so we'd bring in like pavement people who would assess the pavement for strength to kind of see what kind of aircraft would be able to land there or what infrastructure we'd need to bring to the table. But these were very small teams, usually 5 and 6 people, and that was it.
Okay. Yeah, I worked when I was in Iraq back in 2003. Worked a little bit with folks in Red Horse, when it comes to, how you're going to build and lay down airfields, I guess is probably the easy way to say it. And then again, from a planning perspective, in 2008, when the Marine Corps took on Afghanistan rotations, kind of build up stuff over there in country. So you started in 1998, and then you transitioned in 2004 and went right into the police force at Walnut Creek. And while you were there, you had a number of assignments. They range from patrol officer, driver training instructor, field training instructor, SUI detective. What is SUI for folks that don't know?
In our case, it was Special Investigations Unit, so dealt with narcotics, property crimes, whether it be like burglaries or fraud, drug cases, kind of the whole gamut lumped together.
Okay. And then from there, you also were undercover with California DOJ Narcotic Task Force. You were an agent for them. And then you were a public information officer and also a patrol sergeant. So you reached the rank of sergeant while serving. And then in 2012, you were awarded Walnut Creek's Police Department's Distinguished Service Medal for heroic and life-saving actions. And that was to do with a fatal officer shooting. And, those things are always very significant. Those actions, and there's investigations, and, there's a lot that goes into how they determine things like that. They're always investigated. And then again, you were awarded that medal. That's a significant accomplishment in any police officer's life. Not that you're ever working towards that end, but the recognition that comes with that is important because it shows that you did your job right. But then, we all know that there are stresses that we have when we serve, whether it's in the military or as a first responder, and specifically a police officer. Now, I want to talk about that, but before we get into the specifics on that, let's kind of get into a little bit more of your background in the Air Force. So if there's anything I shouldn't say of importance, but anything of significance that you want to share about your story and your time in the Air Force, let's do that. And then let's also talk to the things that you did as a police officer that were noteworthy before we, get into kind of, the shifting gears from your time in service to what you're doing now. So,
Absolutely. My time in the Air Force, I look back on very fondly. My only regret, honestly, is getting out as early as I did. I wish I would have stayed on the reserve side, and I probably still would be in today. One of the most memorable things that I can remember about my Air Force career is I call it my first real duty assignment. So when I first went in, I was kind of like an officer recruiter. It was like a very temporary assignment until I went into security forces training. And I was assigned to FE Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. And there we had the mission of protecting our ICBM sites where the actual nuclear missiles launch out of the ground. In my case, both in Wyoming and Nebraska. And so my very first assignment as out of college as a butter bar, I literally had 60 troops. And I remember the first day I met my commander. She was an amazing woman and a great leader. And she sat me in her office with my flight sergeant at the time, who was a tech sergeant. And she made it very clear that my sergeant had been doing this job for a very long time. And he was an expert in this field, and that I should really, sit back, listen from him, learn from him, and be the leader, but let him manage the day-to-day operations of my flight. And I think that was a very valuable lesson as a brand new commissioned officer in the Air Force, is to really, really value, obviously, all your people, but your senior enlisted people are actually critical when it comes down to leadership and management of your unit. And so I consider myself just very blessed to have that lesson literally on day one, from the
absolutely.
commander.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, that's incredible advice, from that person. They had your best interest in heart. I mean, obviously for the mission, right? Because, you're there doing your job, but as far as helping you as a young officer, that's exactly what you need to hear for the very reasons, that were stated. I was fortunate too, before I went into the Marine Corps, went in as an officer, but I was working at Lowe's in the evenings, right? So going to school in the daytime, working in the evenings, and there was a Navy chief that was working there in the evenings. He's making extra money, and he was an electronics technician, real smart guy. He was a sage mentor for me for my last year before. He knew I was going into the Marine Corps, and he was constantly giving me advice. And that was like one of the first things he told me. And he beat the drum on it, So I was prepared for that, when I went in, and it was very, very helpful because it's the truth. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And the thing was, I look back then, I was so young. I was right out of college. I mean, I consider myself immature now. Back then, I was always very focused and educated and had a good upbringing, but there was a lot to learn. And I think the most important aspect of my military career was the life lessons that I learned. And I learned those all over the world. I mean, I was stationed in Germany for 2 years. I was sent to Saudi Arabia right after 9/11. I did missions down in South America. And, the interaction that I had with different people, different cultures, different organizations it's invaluable. And you really don't see a lot of that on what I call the civilian side. And, when I talk about like civilian law enforcement, there are a lot of prior military. But when you talk about the people that haven't served in the military, I don't think they have that breadth of just experience and life experience. And, I know when I got commissioned, it's all about the degree, it's about the program, but I think life experience is far more valuable than any college degree, any credential program. It's just actually out there, being with different people, doing the job and learning things. And so I just really, really look back on that fondly.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually had this conversation with my youngest daughter when she was back. She's getting her master's and she's in Canada, but so she was back for Christmas break, and I was just talking about some of the things I'm doing now. And I said, yeah, I've with this podcast, at one point I've kind of expanded who I'm talking with, and to to bring in first responders, police officers, and she was talking about, and of course she's talking about having life experience, right? She's she's 22, and she's hasn't been out in the working world, so she's an academic, for lack of a better word. But she was sharing with me something she thought was important when it comes to police officers. She's like, Dad, those guys, a lot of them, they go right out of high school and then they become police officers. And she's like, not that they're not good people or they don't do good work, but she goes, I remember me at that age, and boy, trying to make the decisions that those people are making, the responsibility they have, are such a young age. She's like, maybe there's some way that, you know, that maybe they don't take police officers that young, that they put them through some program, and obviously there's the academy, right, that you go through. So, I never really thought of it that way, because I think the responsibilities that you have as a police officer are very different, I think, than the ones you have as a brand new boot, guy or gal in the military, because of the fact you're interfacing with the public and you've got a weapon and you have to make quick decisions. Not everyone goes right out on the beat. I'm sure, just like in the military, there's different jobs and things that you do from the get-go. You're not going to drop them right into the hot seat. But what are your thoughts on that? I'd be curious. Obviously, you know, you've got a breadth of experience as somebody who, as you said, gained all that worldly experience prior to going in and being a police officer. So you've got that under your belt before going in. What are your thoughts on these young folks that are going right into the academies and then right out onto the streets?
Actually, I have a lot to say about this. The first thing I want to say is that I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. I think this comes down to regionally. So if you're talking about, the Midwest versus the South versus the West Coast, but when you talk about California, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, the vast majority of officers actually have bachelor's degrees, and quite a few are getting master's degrees. And the particular department that I worked at, we almost exclusively only hired people with bachelor's degrees. And so, although you say a lot of people go in right out of high school, I don't think that's a reality. Now things are changing because times are changing. And right now, almost every agency is understaffed and people are leaving in droves. So officers are retiring in record numbers. People just don't want to do the job anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can get into. So I think you're going to see the pendulum swing a little bit, and they're actually starting to take people or hire people that 10 years ago wouldn't even gotten a first look at. And that's a real issue, because there's going to be a domino effect behind that. And I'll get to that. But to your original point, I think that coming right out of high school, no, you're not ready for the job. If I look back when I first graduated high school, there's no way I would have been ready to be a police officer. There's just no way. I didn't have the maturity. I didn't have the life experience. Now, I've been on both sides. I've obviously applied to police departments. I got hired as a new officer, but eventually I became a training officer, where I had to train officers right out of the academy and also from other departments that were switching agencies. And I actually remember a specific incident where there was a good young man. He was very bright, very physically fit. He actually had his college degree, but he had lived at home with his mom and dad the entire time. And his father was actually a very successful police administrator at another agency, and a great, great young man. And I remember during the training process, he just didn't have that life experience. And so he didn't make it. And we literally told him that, hey, now is not the time for you. You need to get some more life experience and maybe think about reapplying in a year or two. And he did that. He applied with a different agency and he's doing very well now. But, to your original point, yes, you need life experience. The police academy alone is not going to make you a successful police officer. It's just not. It's going to teach you the foundations of the law and give you the foundations of training that you need. But when it comes down to it, we are the ones that go on people's worst days. So you're talking about domestic violence situations. You're talking about, child custody issues, anything like that. We're giving life advice. We're literally talking to people usually older than us who have been married for years. They have children. I mean, I remember when I was brand new, I wasn't married. I had no kids, yet I find myself giving marital and relationship and child, rearing advice. And that's what we're expected to do. And we're expected to do basically everything. And even now, if you look at it, we're expected to be, almost mental health therapists or clinicians, and we're making, these decisions on whether or not we're going to commit people for an involuntary hold, if they're a danger to themselves or a danger to others. And we have to make these split second, oftentimes life determining decisions. And so, yes, life experience is so very important.
Yeah, Michael, I always step back and think about what you just said and about the the pressure and the stress to perform and to get it right, because you need to get it right every time, because it only takes one time for things to go really bad. And it doesn't mean that everyone's perfect. Absolutely, people are making mistakes and they're learning from those mistakes. But I always tell folks when I talk about the difference between being in the military and being a police officer. In the military, yeah, there's danger, right? You deploy to combat, that's dangerous. Prior to deploying, you're training. And if you're out in the field, things go really wrong out there too. That's dangerous. When you're back in garrison, when you're back on base, things can happen. But it's not every day that you go out that things can go really wrong because of the line of work that you're in. And that police officers leave their house in the mornings and they might not come back. And their families are dealing with that stress. It's like the operating system running in the background. It's always there, whether you address it, whether you talk to it, it doesn't go away. I mean, there are ways obviously to, try to manage that, but the stress and the significance in what you people are doing, interfacing with the public. And then you got to think about probably a good percentage of the people you're dealing with aren't the, upper echelon of society in terms of, being good citizens, obeying the laws, helping other folks. You certainly run into those people and sometimes they even help you, I guess, right? But yeah, there's just so much that your community, the police community, is having to deal with. And like you said, things are changing. The past 2+ years, things seem to have kind of flipped upside down. And you also talked about, and before I forget, I did want to mention this about the education piece. I did 21 years in the Marine Corps, and probably about midway through, I started really noticing that a lot of the junior personnel and staff NCOs had degrees. And it was pretty incredible, especially on the reserve side, because I worked with the reserves twice in my career. And the second time, there were a boatload of guys and gals that absolutely had, some had PhDs, some were lawyers, professional engineers. Now, I mean, that probably makes a little more sense on the reserve side, right? Because they have a life when they're not wearing their uniform. But yeah, it's pretty amazing that whether it's the military or the police, that we were able to have really good candidates to choose from that were deciding to either come in and start their career, or they wind up getting those degrees while they're serving and they stay in. That's huge. So we have a uh, much more skilled, and hopefully by the time you have all that schooling under your belt too, as you're working, you have a very different perspective because of what you're going through in the programs that you go through. So yeah, that's significant. I didn't know that in terms of how many folks were being hired with degrees. I just wasn't connected, on the police force side. I didn't know that. That's good to hear.
On a couple things there, the most obvious reason is in California, law enforcement are paid actually pretty well and they have great benefits. And so it's one of those things where if you're going to compensate your people properly, you're going to recruit good applicants with strong education and strong backgrounds. But if you go somewhere, in the Midwest or the Deep South where, they're not paying these people very much money at all, then your hiring standards are going to be a lot lower. And, we could go into a whole debate about that subject, but
Right.
I think that's why in California, especially, you actually see a very high percentage of educated police officers. And California is also considered to be one of the leaders in technology in advancements in education in all areas when it comes to public safety and specifically law enforcement.
Right. Well, let me ask a question then, kind of along these lines, since we're talking about it. So, advice for somebody who has served in the military and they're thinking about law enforcement. Do you have a couple, words of wisdom for them from the transition perspective, what they need to be thinking about? What's the best way to go about securing a job in a police force?
Absolutely. I actually get asked this all the time, and I try to help people out with this. But, the first thing is decide what area, what geographic area it is that you want to work in, right? So here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have just tons and tons of departments in a small geographic area. So you could literally apply to 40, 50 different agencies if you wanted to. But my advice is to do your research, find out the backgrounds of the cities, of the agencies, because some are big, some are small, some are medium, and that equates to different opportunities. If you go to a very small agency, there's going to be less opportunity for you as far as like special assignments, whether it's investigations or SWAT, school resource officers, those types of things. But once you narrow down your list, what you really need to do is do ride-alongs with these agencies. And you can actually go to the police department. There's forms that you can fill out as a prospective applicant, and you can go on ride-alongs on different shifts with different officers at these agencies. And that's really where you're going to get that feel of, how does this agency operate? How are the people that work here? What are the types of calls that they respond to? You're literally getting a passenger seat view into what it is that those officers do day in and day out. And, you may luck out. Sometimes you go on a very busy shift and you may ride on another one. It's completely, dead. It's completely quiet. And so you
Right.
have to do a couple different ride-alongs, pick different days of the week, pick different shifts, but just don't go out there and apply to 50 different agencies. Really decide where it is that you want to go. And when you have your interviews, let's say you start the process, usually you fill out an application, usually there's some kind of written test. And if you make that cutoff, they'll have a first kind of oral board, which is kind of like a group panel. And during that oral board, they're going to ask you, like, first of all, why you? Why should we hire you? So you need to be able to articulate what sets you apart from all the other applicants. And so if we're talking about prior military service, that's an absolute goldmine. I mean, you have to be able to articulate what it is that you did in the military, but more importantly, what were your responsibilities? What kind of supervision roles did you have? Because it doesn't matter what your rank is in the military, you have responsibilities and there's supervisors at all levels. And so you need to be able to articulate what exactly it is that you did, not just, I fixed planes or I stood guard at a gate shack, that type of thing, but really be able to explain it and articulate it, because the law enforcement world does not understand the military terminology. And so you have to kind of put it into civilian language and kind of, so they'll understand what it is that you're talking about. Um, and when you're on that ride along, talk to other officers, see what the interaction is, see how they treat you. Because I've heard different stories where sometimes people will go on a ride along and they're kind of treated like an outcast. Nobody talks to them. And I've heard the polar opposite where somebody goes on a ride along and they were like, everyone was so helpful and friendly and they're introducing themselves and talking to me, and they're acting like I actually already worked there. And so you got to really feel out that environment and find out what's the best fit for you.
Right. Well, that's tremendous advice, and it's interesting, but in a good way, to understand that when you're if you're leaving service and you want to go and become a police officer, if that's what you believe you want to do, it's really not a whole lot different than going to interview for any other job. Just like you said, the police force isn't going to understand your acronyms that the Navy or the Marine Corps or the Air Force has, because it's a different organization. So you have to understand that you need to speak clearly in terms that they will understand. That's important across the board. And the other thing, these ride-alongs sound like a real-time informational interview, right? A lot of times, folks that I've interviewed that are talking about leaving the force, the importance of informational interviews in the industries that you're looking to go into. So that sounds like that's a real time, in the seat opportunity to be able to do just that. And that's exciting. I've thought about that. I've got some friends who are officers that have asked me to, hey, why don't you come for a ride along? And it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. And then I haven't done it, right? It's like, but yeah, I mean, if I was younger and I was looking to go into the police force, I mean, that to me, that's a no brainer. You should absolutely want to do that for the reasons that you discussed. And yeah, uh, you talked about the potential of, not the potential because, this is probably more, it happens probably more than you'd like it to, but when you are called to a situation where there is a domestic disturbance, if I remember correctly, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that's probably one of the most head on a swivel things that you guys go to, right? Because they can quickly turn bad. I've heard that a lot of the times uh, those are the calls where police officers wind up getting hurt. Is that pretty much accurate?
I would say, yeah, I mean, it's the most obvious thing to point out, but one thing I want to take a step back on, you mentioned this earlier when you kind of compared combat veterans
Hmm.
and law enforcement. And one thing I want to kind of describe, which I don't think the average person thinks about, but if you're in combat, you're in a known hostile zone or hostile area for a defined period of time. And usually it's kind of clear who the enemy is. And when you leave that hostile zone, you're in a safe zone. So whether that's, back stateside, you're at your base, um, or you're off duty, you're off duty. But in law enforcement, and especially in today's climate, you are literally in combat every single day, all day for years. We're talking 20 to 30 years. And I really want people to stop and just think about that for a second. And I'm not even talking about the hundreds of traumatic incidents and calls that we're going to go to, but you have to understand that literally everyone is a potential threat. We are always have our head on a swivel. We're always on high alert. We're always on guard. It doesn't matter if you're on a meal break, you're getting Starbucks, or you're out to lunch with your friends. Somebody could walk in and gun you down. And it's happened across this country. And now there's a huge anti-law enforcement sentiment where not only are officers on duty being targeted, but off duty, and even they're being followed home and their families are being targeted. And so imagine that toll alone, the psychological toll of always being on high alert, of never being in a quote unquote safe zone, and everyone is a potential threat. And I don't think most people think about that, because I think the general public accepts that our combat veterans, they go to dangerous situations, they may be killed. If they come back, they may have post-traumatic stress injury. The average citizens, for some reason, they don't look at our law enforcement the same way. They're not as accepting to say, wait a minute, these guys and gals are facing threats every single day. They're exposed to nonstop trauma, and they don't even equate the fact that they actually have post-traumatic stress injury. And just
Right.
like the military, our suicide rate is off the charts. We are much more likely to die by our own hands as first responders than on the streets or by an assailant. And that's the same for the military. It's the
Right.
exact same.
Yeah, and the numbers on that end are going up instead of coming down. And thank you for saying that. That was kind of my intent. When I talk about the difference between being in harm's way, that you guys, like you said, it's every day, and then there are a lot of things that tie into that. Who those folks might be at any given moment when you guys are out doing what you do, but then also in your off time, like you talked about, and that's significant. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on my program today, is to talk to these issues, because things are absolutely changing in society, and it breaks my heart, as somebody who cares about our country, but also cares about the community that I live in, family members that I have that live in other parts of the country, friends, where you see police officers treated horribly, and it's
Yeah.
not every place, but it's and more than enough. And I don't know how they do it. I've thought about this many times. I I don't think I mean, I guess if I was in the situation, I would, I would do what I needed to do, but the patience that must be applied and the constant, on your guard, man, that would wear you down. And I don't know how it is police officers are able to maintain their professionalism in situations where I feel, as Scott Duncan, I would probably throttle somebody, you know, and then I say, "Oh, geez, you're not going to do that, or you shouldn't do that as a police officer. That's not really your function." But to your point, when this is every day, it's wearing down the folks that are out there serving, and something has to happen to where we're educating people. It's I'm 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 tired of hearing that the police need to be educated about, I think it's kind of the other way around. I think, or maybe it's both, right? It's not one size fits all, but I think there needs to be education to what you guys are going through in some of the specifics, in addition to how you guys interface with people in society. I think it all probably has to happen together, and there needs to be more people talking about what you and I are talking about now, so that folks can see it, similar and even more involved than people who are serving in the military and what they're dealing with. Because the post-traumatic stress that comes with being in that constant, head on a swivel. I Again, I know, I served in combat. I saw some stuff that was, tough. You're not going to unsee it. Um, but that time's over in my life, right? And it wasn't like that for 21 years. Um, yeah, God bless you guys. It always, I'm kind of at a loss for words here, because it's something that I just couldn't imagine having to do. Even though I was a Marine, I couldn't imagine what you guys are going through, what the folks who are currently serving are going through daily. That's just,
We're literally called on people's worst day of their life most of the time. People don't call 911 on their best day. And so, the horrible thing is that when people ask me, you know, about traumatic incidents, I could literally talk about them for hours. But if somebody asks me, well, mention some good things, I have a real hard time bringing up good stories or good memories as a police officer. And that's the sad reality of this. And, the types of calls that we go to and day out, they're not just fights or domestic violence, but we're talking about suicides. We're talking about fatal car accidents, or even just serious injury car accidents, or pedestrians getting hit by cars, child deaths, child drownings, medical calls, child custody disputes, big bar brawls, right? We're expected to be able to go into active shooter situations and neutralize that threat immediately. And these are the things that's the expectation, right? And we're going to these types of calls literally day in and day out. But one thing I want you to think about too, and this has a ripple effect, is that, so we get sent to calls, right? If somebody calls 911 or somebody reports a crime, we as law enforcement get sent to that location to address it, to bring calm, to bring order. The other side of policing, which is very important, is proactive policing. And I was very proactive, to where I was constantly out there doing enforcement stops, trying to find the guns, trying to find the illegal drugs, trying to find the wanted parolees and probationers, that type of activity. But with the current climate right now, there's been a huge reduction in proactivity. Because why? Because there's no support at any level. There's no support from administrations. There's no support from city governments, county governments, even state governments when you talk about it. So every potential stop that somebody makes is a potential lawsuit, is a potential complaint, is a potential, firing, and then maybe potentially being convicted or sent to prison or jail. I mean, think about that. And when I was active and I worked the graveyard shift at night, I would do 20, 30 stops a night, literally trying to take guns, drugs, and criminals off the street. And when you have a police force who is no longer going to be proactive and they're only going to be reactive, we're going to have real problems. And we've already seen the crime rate absolutely skyrocket across this country. And we've seen brazen crime where groups of people are going in and just stealing in mobs from stores. And so we have to think about, if we talk about defunding police and limiting the police, what's the alternative to that? And so that's one side of it. But I do agree with you that we as law enforcement, we need to do a better job in educating the public. And that's part of the purpose of why Dr. Springer and I wrote this book that's coming out, because we are showing the toll of the job. We're showing the human side behind the badge and the uniform, because we're not superheroes and we're not invincible. We are willing to put our life on the line every single day, but we're human. And all these things take a toll on us. And we don't ever talk about it. We don't ever acknowledge it. And we're very good at putting up this front that nothing bothers us, nothing phases us. But I can tell you personally, it does bother us, and it affects us every single day.
Yeah, I don't know how it couldn't. And the politics involved in what's happening is unseemly. It's wrong. Um, we can debate that, but it's decisions are being made politically, and I think it's very short-sighted. They're looking for immediate impact to things they see as problems, and they're not thinking about the second and third order effect of the policy changes or implementations that they're throwing in, right? You would hope that most of it would be they believe that what they're doing is going to be of benefit. But I think there's also some very heavy political overtones involved in this too. And it's because there's an anti-police sentiment that's out there. We saw it really kick up in 2020. And I always have such a frustration in this when people are talking about, oh, well, folks were just out, exercising their First Amendment freedoms. Yeah, a good portion were, but there were a lot of people that were out there doing anything but. They were taking advantage of the situation, and they were breaking the law willfully. And just like you were talking about now, we're seeing groups of people breaking into stores and clearing the shelves. And what happens, because they've changed laws in certain states to where, yeah, it's like $1,000 now is your threshold. Well, if the DA is not going to prosecute, why waste your time arriving on scene to manage something that's just an admin shuffle? Why put yourself at risk for getting shot when this idiot is going to be right back out on the street because there's no will to hold them accountable for breaking the law? We're seeing that in a lot, and it seems like it's mostly in big cities, to where, I guess they're maybe trying to appease people too. I've got my thoughts on where all this might be going, but anyone who would think that that's not going to have a deleterious effect on people who are there to protect and serve, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because when you take everything else that you guys deal with, then you throw this new dynamic on top of it where, yeah, let's defund the police. Let's, change how they are supposed to interact with people. If let me ask you this, because I was thinking about this while you were talking. In a lot of precincts, I understand that they're looking to add like a social worker to come and take part in the calls you guys respond to. So I don't know how that would work. Would it be just domestic disputes? Was that happening while you were in the service too? Or is that, because I don't know. I just think that's probably something that happened here recently, here as much as say 2020, 2021. Is that just edge dressing, or is that something that you think makes a difference? Would that help in what police officers do?
Well, it's not an easy answer. So let me start, and I'll say this: in some areas in California, that concept has been around for quite a while. And we actually, when I was still working, we had teams where we teamed up with the county, and we had specific officers who rode along with therapists or clinicians. And a lot of times they would go out together and follow up on people that were causing constant issues or had problems, not that were violent per se, but were more of a nuisance. And we were trying to work with them to get them the proper resources to help them. And that was the early stages. What's happening right now, specifically in a lot of agencies, is, for instance, my girlfriend actually, she works for a very large agency here in the Bay Area, and uniformed officers team up with social workers, and they have a proactive approach where they go out to like the homeless encampments, and they go out and contact the homeless people or the transients and try to get them connected with resources, try to get them off the streets, try to find them shelter, food, housing. All of that, I think, is a great idea. I think it's a very useful tool.
Makes sense. Yeah.
I think we definitely need more of it. Are we ever going to have where just a social worker or two social workers are going to respond to potentially dangerous calls? No, that's not feasible. It's not possible. If that happens, lives are going to be lost. And so I think it's a great tool and resource to have for the proper types of calls. And especially if we're talking about being more proactive as opposed to reactive, I think it's totally appropriate. What I also know is that here in California, and I think other states, is that a lot of officers are becoming crisis intervention training officers. So they actually go through specialized training on how to deal with people in crisis. And I think that's a very valuable tool. And that's something that I'm talking sworn police officers, they go through additional training and they go through update trainings. And so if you have a good percentage of those trained officers on your force, I think that's also going to help. So I do think we need to change things. I don't think we can leave things as status quo. There definitely has to be changes. But, I have to laugh at this. There was here in the Bay Area, in Berkeley, of all cities, I'm sure you've heard of it, but they actually wanted to come up with an ordinance where basically civilians would do traffic enforcement stops and they wouldn't be armed, and they would actually pull people over and issue citations if necessary. Now, traffic stops actually are one of the most dangerous things that you can do. And that's what I wanted to get back to at that domestic violence point that you had, is that when officers are doing vehicle stops, bicycle stops, pedestrian stops, that's where the vast majority of officers are being killed, because they don't know the threat. They don't know if they have weapons on them. They don't know if they're wanted for murder, and they're initiating a contact with this person, and they could be very violent. They could be very dangerous. And so, we really have to carefully think this out. And I don't have the clear black and white answer on this. I can just tell you that we need to do more. And addressing mental health for the outside is one thing, but let's talk about the mental health of our people, because it's been proven that if officers are healthy, and when I mean healthy, I mean mentally healthy, they're much less likely to use inappropriate force. They're much more likely to have less complaints. So there's actually a positive effect where if our officers are healthy, they're going to be able to think more clearly. They're going to be able to make more sound decisions. They're going to be able to act appropriately and not act out of emotions.
Right.
And that's what we really need to talk about and we need to address.
Yeah, your perspective on this is priceless, Michael, and because you served, and you have that experience, and I like the way that you quickly had a reply to my question about having these additional folks that are trained to be social workers, or the clinical side of these issues. And yeah, I mean, what you said makes perfect sense, right? But if in order to be proactive, then that needs to be understood, and how all that comes together. And yeah, the traffic stops that you guys do, you never know who the heck you're pulling over. You could just be the lucky guy that's pulled over a really bad person that's armed, they've got drugs or whatever, or they're just in a bad mood that day, and then it goes from there. Now I know in I don't know whether it's this way in California. I do know in Virginia, if if you're pulling over a vehicle and there's a thought that it's a stolen vehicle, you approach the car with weapons drawn. Is that the same in California?
Well, there's actually specific procedures. We call it a high risk traffic stop. So,
Right.
when you're talking, and there's differences. So if you're talking about like a deputy sheriff who has no cover for miles and miles away, or a state trooper, or if you're talking about in a city where a cover officer is literally maybe a minute or two away,
Hmm.
like in our case, if we had a vehicle and we thought it was stolen, we would actually ask for a cover officer before we even turn our lights on, because we want to make sure that we have adequate resources in place if this person decides to take off.
Right.
And stolen vehicles, it's a felony. It's a very serious stop. And if they do pull over, then we have set procedures on what we do. And we don't just go up to the vehicle. I mean, we call it a high risk traffic stop, where we've got several police cars. We've got some people with their tasers, some people with their handguns. We may have canine officers, and then we're giving specific verbal commands to talk people out of the car one at a time. So we put them at a disadvantage and make sure that they aren't armed, and then get them secured, and then deal with the next person, and so on until the car is clear. But there's a whole set of practices that we practice all the time and we train for. So, that's the thing, is there's a lot of things that the public aren't aware of
Yes.
that we actually prepare for, because we want to go home safely at night. And so we train to go home to our families every single day. I mean,
Right.
we can't stop everything. We can't prevent everything, but we do our best to mitigate potentially lethal or deadly outcomes.
Right. And getting kind of back to the topic or the tone of training, right? Training the public. That's something I think folks need to know more about, because that's the point to where things can go quickly wrong and someone can get shot. And when the person who is in the car or who comes out of the car gets shot, then it becomes significant. You know, People just kind of wrongly, not that they accept police officers getting shot, right? Because you're in the line of duty, and yes, that's a chance you're going to get shot. But when there's an officer involved shooting, when they shoot somebody, this could go really off the deep end in the press. So the more people understand about what you just said, that it's not an all or nothing approach. It's a graduated approach. There's timing involved. It's based on the situation. You have things that you guys have through your training that help you manage these calls. And so the more people understood that, probably, the hope would be that if something does happen, that it's like, okay, these folks were trained properly, they were well reasoned in how they went about, getting to the point to where someone gets shot. I think that's important, because a lot of folks just think that police officers roll up, and if the person's not obeying, their commands, that it just goes wrong from there, and then someone winds up getting shot. I don't think that, but I think a lot of folks do.
Well,
And
well, here's
yeah,
the
go
thing
ahead.
on that. So most police officers are never even involved in a shooting. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions out there. And I know the media would have you believe otherwise,
Yeah,
but just,
yeah.
just as an example, my stepfather, he worked in law enforcement for over 30 years. He worked in one of the most dangerous cities, Richmond, California. It's one of the most dangerous cities in California. At one time was one of the most dangerous cities in the nation per capita.
Where is that in California?
Richmond,
Geographic.
California, it's about 15 minutes outside San Francisco.
Okay.
And it's about 15 minutes from where I work. So the Bay Area has got a lot of different cities within it. And
Sure.
he was never involved in a fatal shooting. As an example, my agency, when I was involved in my fatal shooting, there hadn't been one for at least 12 or 14 years. Now, think about this for a second. If we go to 20 or 30,000 calls a year for 14 years, do the math. And in that time frame, my shooting was the only officer involved fatal shooting during that time. And you look at the percentage of that versus the amount of people contacted. That's my point, is that most officers, it's less than 1% of police officers are ever involved in a fatal shooting. But if you watch TV, if you look at the news, you would think that officers are involved in shootings all the time.
Yeah.
Now, I retired in 2018. My shooting was in 2012. And at my agency alone, they've only had one other officer involved shooting. I mean, only one other since 2012. And then prior to 2012,
10
it had been,
years. Yeah.
12 or 14 years. And so my point is, that is the biggest misconception, is that most officers never, I mean, we pull our gun out all the time. I pulled my gun out hundreds of times. I've only been involved in one shooting. But like I said, for most officers, it never happens.
Yeah. Well, that's significant too. And, the if they did do the math, and if they did, drumbeat wise show the numbers, that matters, right? Math is math. Statistics, you can do things with statistics, but the numbers you're talking to are solid numbers, right?
Yeah.
And the more that folks are aware of that, perceptions hopefully begin to change. Now let's do this, Mike, because it's we've been doing this almost an hour already. It's these things run away quickly, especially when we're talking about the stuff we're talking about. I entitled this "Ask for Help" because that's a lot of what you're doing now, is you're helping people. How much more time do you have on our interview today?
I've got about 15 minutes, and then I have another
Okay.
interview after
Okay.
that. So,
Well, I hate to condense this part, but let's kind of talk about that now. The ask for help, right? What led you to what you're doing now?
so I'll try to make this brief, but as a brand new patrol sergeant back in 2012, my shift started the night after Christmas. And I went to a call where there was a subject with a butcher knife that was trying to kill a couple. And this subject then went, and I was first on scene. Another officer showed up. We ran towards the condominium. And eventually the subject tried to kill myself and my officers. And unfortunately, we had to take his life to save the life of the couple that was barricaded upstairs in their bedroom. Now, this incident immediately changed me. I remember going home later that morning after being up for 30 hours and going through multiple investigative interviews. And I felt immediately detached and numb from my wife at the time and my daughter. And all I wanted to do was go upstairs to my bedroom with my blackout shades and just go to sleep and hope this was some nightmare, that it wasn't real, and that I would just wake up and everything would be okay. And it wasn't. And so I started having constant nightmares. I started isolating socially, both with friends, with family, with my own spouse. I wasn't talking to her or anybody about what happened because I was under 2 investigations. And I was also sued immediately, a federal lawsuit that drug on for 4 years. And my marriage started falling apart. I started drinking way too much, trying to drink myself to sleep every single night. And then it got to a point where there was actually a court proceeding for this incident. It wasn't a criminal proceeding, but it was a civil proceeding. And during this proceeding, it was open to the public. The person that I killed, his family was there. I didn't mention he had an identical twin brother. So this face that I couldn't get out of my nightmares for years was literally staring at me. My wife was there because I was hoping she would hear what happened and maybe understand why I was being such an asshole, why I was acting the way I was, why I was being so distant and detached. And during this court proceeding with a jury and a judge, I broke down. I ended up bawling like a baby in a room full of people. And I was ashamed. I was absolutely embarrassed and ashamed. As a former Air Force officer, as a police sergeant, I had never cried in front of anybody, and certainly not in a room full of 60, 70 people. When I got done testifying, the judge excused me. I remember I went to the restroom, splashed water on my face, got myself together, came back to the courtroom, went through the proceedings. My officers did great. And about 2 weeks after that, we got the finding that we wanted from this civil hearing. And my supervisor called me into the office. And I thought for sure, being a brand new police sergeant in a city where shootings don't happen, where we save lives, our officers were all fine. We did well in the hearing, that I was going to get kudos. I was going to get accolades for leading, for doing a good job. And what happened was very pivotal in this room. And I tell this part not to talk bad about my agency, because I worked for a phenomenal agency with great people. But this particular incident is where I made a huge mistake. I remember I walked in, I could tell the demeanor was not good, and they questioned the genuineness of my emotions. They both directly said and inferred that I was acting or putting on a show for the jury. Now, think about that. Here I am, a grown man. I've never cried in front of anybody. I'm already ashamed and embarrassed. And now my very integrity is being questioned. And then my leadership ability was being put into question. Up to this point, my career was off the charts in both the military and the civilian side, had never been questioned. And then my probationary status got extended as a brand new sergeant. And so I made a conscious decision, instead of asking for help like I should have, because I was too ashamed and too embarrassed and too worried about the ramifications of that, that I sucked it up. I told myself I would never show emotion again. And I became a total asshole. I became unapproachable at work. I became a horrible supervisor. I lost all empathy and sympathy for my people. And I literally just tried to do the polar opposite of being human and showing emotion. And so now fast forward, my marriage is done. I'm going through a divorce. My lawsuit drags on for 4 years. And every year I'm going through depositions with the father of the man that I killed sitting directly across the table from me. My stepfather, who was my hero, he was a retired police lieutenant. He died at 58 from stage 4 cancer. I started getting diagnosed with skin cancer. I mean, my world was falling apart. Finally, I go to trial. I'm actually on federal trial in San Francisco in 2016. It took 4 years. And now at this time is the start of the anti-law enforcement movement. At this time, there's actually 4 very big controversial police shootings across the nation. And I'm literally there in San Francisco fighting for my life. And I told myself, once this trial was over, if I made it through it, all my problems would just disappear. And so I went through the trial, and it made things much, much worse. We ended up prevailing. We actually won the trial. And the judge was actually Judge Breyer, the brother of the Supreme Court Justice Breyer, who's getting ready to retire. And he even said, had it not been for our actions, more lives would have been lost that night. But sitting in that courtroom for 2 weeks and hearing all these crazy theories from the other attorneys, from seeing the identical twin brother, the same face that tried to kill me in the courtroom, it took an absolute toll. And I got to the point where I didn't want to be here anymore. I started putting myself in dangerous situations at work, hoping I died in the line of duty. I knew that if I died in the line of duty, my daughter, who I was fighting for custody for, would never forget who her dad was. I would be memorialized. Roads would be named after me. Nobody would forget me. And it was about a month after that, my best friend, John, he was a Vietnam veteran, a 35-year reserve officer with my department. He had retired 2 years earlier. He tried to kill himself when I was on duty. He slit both wrists. He stabbed himself in the torso, OD'd on multiple prescription medications. Thank God I got to the trauma center right when the ambulance brought him in. He was covered in blood, in and out of consciousness. And I had 15 seconds with him before they rushed him off to emergency surgery. And I told him he was going to pull through this, but I really didn't think he was going to make it. And I remember sitting there for hours at the hospital with his sister and other people at the department. And I started blaming myself. I started feeling the guilt of, why didn't I recognize that my best friend was suffering? I had no idea that he was suffering like he was. I had no idea he would ever contemplate taking his own life. And thank God he made it through that. But it was a month after that, on the anniversary of my shooting, is when I finally got the strength and the courage to ask for help. Because all I could think about was my daughter. Was she going to blame herself for me taking my own life? And there was no way I was going to let her live with that. There was no way. And so finally, I got the strength and courage to ask for help. And I know today right now, it's the strongest, bravest, most courageous thing I've ever done in my entire life. Nothing I did
Amen.
in the military, nothing I did on the streets, nothing I did during that shooting. It was me asking for help.
My God, Michael, I can't imagine, yeah, the, and you're not, un, unfortunately, you're not the only one that's going through these same things, right? In terms of the experience that other officers are now having, as well. And when you talk about somebody questioning your integrity, if you're a person of integrity, that's a big deal. If your integrity is being challenged, the fact that not everyone's a robot, everyone responds differently, and we all have a threshold of how much we can take. Uh, and then, breaking down like that, that's that's huge, because that's not who you are as a person. I was the same way as a Marine, and at one point after being in combat, I'm not saying it's because of that. I don't know why this is the case, but there was a situation, and I won't go into it, but I also started crying, and it freaked me out because I had never been that way. And, and even now, occasionally, that happens. And, I'm good with it. I'm a man, isn't it? My self-worth isn't any less because I do that. But I also, because of my experiences like you, I live my life differently now. And the fact that you were at some point able to realize all that was going on and then ask for help, that says a lot about who you are, the strengths of making the right decision, even though you have suffered through so much. What what was that, if I can ask this real quick, so what was that help? What was the help that you received, and what are you doing now in helping other people?
So the most important thing was that I got connected with a culturally competent therapist. And what I mean by that in my case is somebody who only worked with first responders, who understood the uniqueness of our profession, of our culture, and understands the level of trauma that we see, somebody who truly gets it. And I remember the first day that I met her, she shared a very deep, dark personal story from her past and how she got through that. And when she opened up to me, that's when I knew I could trust her. I could trust her with my life. And trust is absolutely critical to this process because you have to have absolute trust. You have to know that this isn't going to get out to other people. You have to know there aren't going to be ramifications to your career. You have to know that this person that you're talking to in confidence, not only are they going to keep that, but more importantly, they're going to really understand it. They're going to get it. That was absolutely critical. The second thing was that my therapist told me about these first responder support meetings. They have them all over the US. They're informal discussion meetings. Some are in the 12-step format, like an AA meeting or an NA meeting. Some are just discussion meetings. And the key to this is that it's open to all first responders, whether you're active, retired, out on injury. They're not associated with any agency. They're held offsite, and I won't say a secret location, but not a highly advertised location. And
Right.
you have to be vetted to go to these meetings. And so when I started going to these, the first 3 weeks, I just sat there and listened. But the amazing thing that happened was that was where I first realized I wasn't unique. I wasn't special. I was listening to my brothers and sisters, firefighters, cops, paramedics, dispatchers, who are opening up and sharing very personal things, both from childhood to on the job trauma to relationship issues, alcohol addiction, drug abuse, openly sharing in a trusted environment. And that's where I realized that I wasn't alone. And there's other people who they get it. They're feeling the same way I am. And eventually I got the strength and courage to share in that group setting. And the power of sharing, taking that burden off your shoulders, knowing that you aren't alone is key to this whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely key.
And there's so much grace to that, Michael. And, you know, Sarah Carell, who has the power of our story, that's kind of the underlying, you know, premise that, there is power in stories and being able to share in a trusted environment. The trust is huge. That's absolutely right. And like you said, you're also seeing that you're not alone, that other people that you look at who appear to be stoic, they're battling the same issues.
Absolutely.
And maybe they're worse. I mean, who knows, right? And how do they go about handling these things? And so then you have a peer network that you start to develop, folks that you can hopefully start to confide in and have trust when you're in that circle talking about these things. Yeah, that's tremendous. I'm very, very glad that you found that, because we need people like you in our societies, not just in law enforcement, but people who are in our communities helping and doing good things, and which is what you're doing now. And you are doing a tremendous service for our men and women in uniform, because because you've lived it and you've survived. And so now you have answers. You have, you can shed light in very dark areas in people's lives to help them, understand and know that there is a path, that there is goodness that can help them, and of course they have to be involved in doing this too, right? It's not like someone's just going to raise them up out of the, out of the depths and they're going to be okay. There's work involved, right? It's a two-way street. But having people like you, um, there's a lot of very thankful people. And I wish we had more time. And since you have to move on to your next interview, I do want to ask real quickly, if some of the folks that are watching right now have a question or two. Do you have time for maybe one or two questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, real quick here. Let me see. So, hey, Vaughn and Daniel, you guys are still with us. Do either of you guys have a question or a comment for Michael?
I have many comments. I'll just share one. I mean, I just feel like your story is so powerful. And my brother was a police officer. My dad was a colonel in South Vietnamese Air Force, and my brother was a police officer. He's now retired, and he never talked about anything, and he still doesn't. He's not the same person, right? I don't know what he goes through, but he's not the little fun little brother I had when we were growing up. And he needs to hear your story. I think, like you said, like once you started telling it, it allowed other people to tell their stories, and you're certainly not alone. So just more of a comment on, I really commend you for what you're doing for your community, for the families of those, first responders who suffer. And I just hope more people will listen to this and hear how powerful it is.
Thank you. Yeah, like I said, I'm not unique and I'm not special. And there are countless people out there just suffering in silence because of the stigma, because they say it's not okay to ask for help, and it's shameful and it's embarrassing.
Right.
And, I'm living proof that there's a whole new life on the other side. I have a better life today than I've ever had. And I'm actually a better person than I ever was. And that's the beauty of this whole thing, is that I look at people differently. I look at life differently. I was a very black and white person when it came to the law. And it was like, you're either a criminal or you're not. And this whole process has really opened up my mind and my feelings towards addiction, towards alcoholism, towards trauma, and really getting to the root cause of these issues and these problems, because everyone turns to these negative coping mechanisms to numb themselves and to get away from this trauma.
And just one last thing, like, I worked with an organization works with young boys. It's called, there's this movie they made called The Mass We Live In, I believe it's called. And it's about, how men are raised not to show emotion from when you're a very small child. And then you add on the military, you add on the environment in law enforcement, you add on that you broke down and were faced with, like, were you faking it? Right.
Exactly.
It's like how, like, it's going to take people like you to continue to speak up and tell your story so that people understand that this is what we learn, we need to unlearn.
I mean, emotion is normal. That's the thing, is like, and Scott even said it, but I was so embarrassed and ashamed. And like, I cry occasionally now. I mean, it's appropriate. It's normal. It releases that tension. What's not normal is sucking it in and pretending like it doesn't exist, like it doesn't bother you. And so we need to talk about this more and just normalize it, because we're all human. That's
Mhm.
the facts.
Yeah, even tough guys like you, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely. I just want to say again, thank you, Michael, for sharing your story and whatnot. Yeah, and I came in the Army in 1985 to be a military police. And during training for DV, they were showing videos and pictures of some serious things that could happen. And some, fellow soldiers ran out because they couldn't handle it. And I remember the drill sergeant saying, those guys aren't going to make it. You can't show emotion in this job. To be a good MP, you got to have thick skin and all that. And that's how I was brought up into it. And just my story, until you're able to be vulnerable and share your story, then and you start to learn you're not alone. We're not walking this path alone. And
Absolutely.
so I credit you for that. When I was able to share my story and take a deep look in what I saw and actually admit that, hey, I saw some crappy stuff, my vulnerability became my strength, and that continues to help me in my resilience. And you mentioned, a lot of times it's hard for us to see the good stuff. I also learned in my Army Master Resiliency training that we have to hunt the good stuff, especially those of us first responders, military, because we're always, we're trained to look for bad things. We're trained to look at people's hands. We're trained to look at, who's going to come at us next. And, you got to take a step back and hunt the good stuff and just continue to move on and share your story like you are. I think it's great. I appreciate you and I have a lot of respect for you. And thanks, Scott, for bringing it on. Good to see you, Bob.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, hey, kind of in closing here, what I want to say is you mentioned something, Michael, but I could see it in you, and as you were talking, that you look like you're a better person now. Not that you weren't a good person through all of this, right? But because of your experience and the empathy that you've gained through trial through fire, and that you survived. And it says a lot about you that you cared enough to turn around and to start reaching your hand out to these other people in the community to help them along too, because the battles that these people are going through. That says so much about you. Again, the grace involved with that. You mentioned Dr. Springer. She's awesome. I've been on 2 different calls with her, and I learned something from her every time. So what a good person to be working with. So, Michael, thank you for your time. Thank you for, again, what you're doing now. I wish we had more time, because I think we could probably talk about this for another hour easily.
Easily.
But I know you have to get running. I'd love to have you on again down the road, and we can hear more about this, and then hopefully share again with more people as we move forward. Okay. Well, hey, Michael, thank you. Have a great rest of your evening, and I appreciate the fact that Daniel and Vaughn were here to share with us as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. God bless you guys.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, Michael.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
Daniel.